Hey, good morning. Hope you're all staying warm and safe. Um, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to explain the topic we would have discussed in class. Of course, if you have questions, you're more than welcome to reach out, email. When winter finally goes away, you're welcome to come by and ask those questions in person. Uh, but the technique or idea we are going to look at today is called the Earth systems approach. And so the idea with it is that we're giving a tool or a framework to help students look at a particular event, incident, whatever that might be. And so one of the challenges when we take a topic in the real world is that there's just a lot of information out there, a lot of sensory information, a lot of possible directions to go. It can be really overwhelming. And so what I really like about the Earth systems approach is that it doesn't get rid of all of that information, all that complexity, but it gives a little bit of help in sort of taking things a piece at a time. Because a lot of times what happens in classrooms to deal with that complexity is just ignoring it and be like, oh, we're just going to look at this one part, period. But the problem is when we do that, we present the idea that that one part kind of exists by itself, and it doesn't. So there are different, depending on where you look, there are different number of Earth systems on kind of how it can be divided. This is the four I would encourage you to look at, especially in the elementary level. I do also want to make a note that this approach can work for standards across grade levels, but it is one that is specifically in a fifth grade standard. So the four systems we're looking at are the biosphere, which is all living things, the hydrosphere, which is water, the atmosphere, which is the air, and the geosphere, that's sometimes called the lithosphere, which is the rocks and soil. And so what we can do with this approach is we take an event and we decide to look at, all right, how do we think this event, this thing affects each of these spheres, and how might these spheres interact with each other? And so when it comes to you planning your lesson for this, a lot of you will feel like you don't have enough. And really that's because this is something that should be very student driven. And as we explore these impacts, we're also going to find questions that pop up. We're like, wait, would this affect trees or would it not? Wait, does that, like, could that do that to the soil? I don't know. Like, it kind of seems like it could, but I'm not sure. Right? A lot of questions will come up along the way. So I'm gonna give you a short example. Before I do that, this works great with 360 videos. This works great in like Google Photo Spheres from Google Maps with photos, with videos, even reading about an event. The other thing is that we're going to assume like whatever it is we're looking at, we're assuming does affect all of these. A lot of times kids take the very superficial, more obvious impacts and they're like, there, I'm done. Tornado wouldn't affect soil. So whatever, like I'm done. Like, okay, we're gonna assume it does. So like let's really try to figure out like how could it? And sometimes those impacts aren't huge, but we're getting them to move past the like obvious, like hurricanes kill trees, and like, yes, but what else? So our example, and I'm trying to purposely choose an example that's not something I think any of you would have wanted to use. Uh, Also, I happened to be listening to an interview a couple weeks ago or over spring break about some research around here that I thought was really interesting. So this is the Glen Canyon Dam, right? And it dams the Colorado River. And so we could take something like building a dam as an example of, okay, how does it affect each of the Earth systems? And so, for example, and of course, in a classroom, you'd want this to be discussion based, but it could be stuff like, when they built the dam, that would have flooded this area, right? There's so much more water up here that probably killed plants that were there, right? You're like, yeah, probably so. Maybe it destroyed some habitat for land animals. Probably. With a lot more water, it probably created habitat for fish that need deep open water. It also, in terms of the biosphere, helped humans in providing a reservoir of water for humans. Now, in terms of the hydrosphere, so water, well, obviously it changed this river's flow a lot. So it changed how the river flow. One that might not seem quite as obvious, but it's definitely an impact. It actually causes a lot more evaporation because there's a lot more water at the surface now instead of a like flowing river. And so there's more evaporation here than there would have been when this was an undammed river. That one goes into the atmosphere of, okay, well, how does it impact the atmosphere? Well, there's probably a lot more evaporation. So that's an impact, right? More evaporation means more water in the atmosphere potentially over this area. And then finally, the lithospheres, the rock and soils, you're like, okay, well, maybe it causes more erosion. But the one, and this is actually what I was listening to in the interview that I thought was really interesting, is it actually has caused a lot of buildup of silt because fast-moving water carries a lot of sediment, and slow-moving water, which this is now, doesn't. And so there's been a lot of buildup of silt in places. And so we can kind of go a step at a time. As you're designing this, the goal is to kind of think about like, okay, what questions are you going to ask to, or prompts are you going to use to try to get students to start to recognize some of the impacts maybe aren't so obvious. What are things you think students are going to say? What are the things you think they're going to struggle with? It is one that as you write down a plan, it's going to feel like not enough. And a lot of that's because this is an approach that requires the input of students, right? You can't like stand up and deliver this lesson without students. As I've shown here quite early this morning, that it doesn't really work very well without the dialogue. And so like in your plan, if you're like, but this doesn't feel like it would work, like, yeah, because you're writing it without students. As always, happy to look at drafts, happy to discuss ideas, types of things that work well for a topic like this. A lot of times they're things like natural disasters. So hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, drought, fire, but it also could be things like maybe where you're from or an area you're thinking about, like, oh, they just removed this wooded area to build a bunch of houses, or along the coast, there's a lot of places where they're removing wetlands to build houses, and it's like maybe you want to use that, or maybe it's an introduced species. So I don't know if you've heard or seen anything about like pythons being introduced in the Everglades and all the impacts from having this introduced species. So it could be a lot of things like that. Definitely email if you have a like, would this work or not? Happy to help with that. Happy to look at rough drafts, whatever you need. Do also want to remind you, make sure you're doing the textbook questions. I apologize, I haven't checked the due date for the what would be 10, 11, 12, but I imagine it's coming up pretty soon. So please go ahead and look at those chapters. All of those questioning strategies are definitely things you could include in this lesson plan. Again, sorry I don't get to see you this morning. Stay warm, stay safe, and hopefully eventually winter ends and I get to see you again. So take care.